So our focal point this morning is we know that once this physical life is over, we move into our heavenly dwelling. The Apostle Paul has told us of the wonderful promise to come when we hold fast to our faith in Jesus. What comes is more glorious than we could ever imagine, and God has given us a down payment on that promise. Last week we talked about what it means to own our suffering redemptively. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verses... hold on, I got to look back again. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 7 through 18 lays out what it means to own your suffering redemptively. When Jesus was talking to the rich young ruler who wanted to be a disciple of his, what did he tell the rich young ruler? Go sell all of your possessions, give them to the poor, take up your cross and follow me. That's what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. It doesn't mean that you wield it over people and you browbeat people with the Bible. It means that you take up your cross, you follow Jesus. And the majority of the time, that comes with suffering. I don't want us to think that we have a persecution complex, that every moment of our life should be in misery or pain or suffering. But when we do hit those situations of our life, and it's inevitable for all of us, something will happen. We'll lose a loved one. We'll get a negative diagnosis at the doctor. When that moment comes, how do we live our life? Do we curl up in a ball and cry and pity ourselves, wallow in our suffering? Or do we own our suffering to be a testimony to the fact that Jesus changes everything about us? And that's our interaction with suffering too. The Apostle Paul says this brief and momentary affliction is building for us an eternal weight of glory that far surpasses it all. When you get to heaven, all the things you've suffered in this life, and your life could be suffering from the moment you're born until the moment you die, all you might have known is suffering. But how do you own your suffering? Just like the three children of Israel, King Nebuchadnezzar had arrested them, was going to throw them in the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar says, "Pray to your God, and I'm sure he will save you." The three sons of Israel said, "We know that our God is mighty to save us, but even if he doesn't, yet will we praise him." That's owning suffering redemptively. And that's a testimony. And Jesus says people will see that upon you, they will notice your deeds, and they will glorify your Father who is in heaven. When you live a life for Christ in the middle of disaster, in the middle of chaos, in the middle of oppression, in the middle of persecution, in the middle of depression, addiction, any negative thing you could think of, and yet you praise Jesus, more people will recognize that than if they see you walking down the street with patent leather shoes, driving your Bentley, flying in your private helicopter, owning a $54 million jet. People will see how you own your suffering and yet praise Jesus in the middle of it more than they will see your prosperity. And that's important for us to understand. The Apostle Paul says this, in chapter 5, we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 10 this morning. And the weird thing about the way that the Bible is now in modern times, in the time of the apostles and the early church fathers, there were no chapters, there were no verses. And so now times when you read the Bible, there's chapter divisions and verse divisions. There's sections that have been broken out within chapters that kind of interrupt the flow of what the author was trying to say. Chapter 4 and chapter 5 go together. It should be all one big thing, but it isn't. We've broken it up into chapters for the convenience of memorizing verses. But The Apostle Paul is still building on his argument from chapter 4. We remember in chapter 4, the Apostle Paul gives us that wonderful promise that this brief momentary affliction is building for us an eternal weight of glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, because what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Now the Apostle Paul moves into chapter 5. There is no chapter division there, just so that we understand that. The Apostle Paul is still continuing his argument. Now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened, because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now it is God who has made us for this very purpose, and has given us the Spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come. Therefore, we are always confident and know that as long as we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. We live by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So we make it our goal to please Him, whether we are at home in the body or away from it, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. You see the flow of the Apostle Paul's argument here? We get the promise in chapter 4, verse 17 and 18, and now the Apostle Paul expands and elucidates on what that promise looks like for us if we're faithful to the end. One thing that you notice there that Paul extrapolates on is that when we have owned our suffering redemptively, and when we have not succumbed to the trials of this life, but we've held fast to our faith in Jesus Christ, we will receive something from Jesus. The Apostle Paul uses an illustration of a building or a temple or even a tent. The Apostle Paul was a tent maker. That's what his trade was. When he wasn't out ministering and pastoring and being a missionary, he built tents. That's what the Apostle Paul did to earn a living. He was a tent maker. Priscilla and Aquila, the two famous Christian disciples that we see in Acts chapter 18, were also famous tent makers, and the Apostle Paul worked with them. The Apostle Paul worked for Priscilla and Aquila making tents. And so the Apostle Paul uses the illustration of a tent. What our mortal body is like a tent. It's like a building. The longer that building exists, and the more winters it goes through, and the more times of trial it goes through, the more pressure, the more burden, the building breaks down. Just like our building out here, I'm sure you've seen it. The thing about buildings that are built with human hands is they will eventually crumble. They will not stand forever. It doesn't matter how ingenious the architect is, how good the craftsmen are about doing their job. The more a building is exposed to weather and trials and pressures and outside external forces, it takes a toll on the building. As human beings living in this mortal body, what the Apostle Paul called in chapter 4 jars of clay. Jars of clay are fragile. They break under very little pressure. I remember when I was gardening with terracotta pots, I was wanting to be some kind of green thumb. I would always work with those stupid clay terracotta pots, and no matter how careful I was with them, I would pack them too tightly, and they would break at the sides. The bottom would fall out. And finally I said, this is ridiculous, I'm going to go get the plastic ones. But we are like jars of clay. We break under little pressure. It doesn't take much stress on us, and we're snapped and broken into 1,000 little pieces. And the Apostle Paul says that we are not only just like a jar of clay, but we're also like a tent built with human hands. We succumb to pressure and trial. We succumb to persecution and external forces. And after a while, we will crumble and deteriorate, and there will be nothing left of us. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. The amazing promise of Christianity is that this life isn't all there is. We step into eternity once this mortal jar of clay crumbles and it succumbs to age and time and weather and pressure. I don't have to live in this jar of clay forever. That's the great hope of Christianity. Could you imagine what life would be like if we didn't have that hope? Let's say nihilism was true, or atheism. All of our great accomplishments, our family legacies, the career that we have built for ourselves, the fortune we've accumulated, if atheism is true, it means nothing. If nihilism is true, this life is all we get, and whatever we do in this life is the only thing that matters. But even more than that, 200 years ago, nobody will remember your name. The great hope of Christianity is that this life isn't all there is. We step into eternity, and this brief, momentary affliction, a millimeter dot on an endless ruler, is what we get when we believe in Jesus Christ. And we groan and we long to be clothed in our heavenly dwelling. Our body aches and moans and groans to take on the incorruptible. Our body aches and groans and moans to take on the eternity promised by Jesus Christ in John 11:25. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me will live even though they die. That's the great hope of Christianity. And the amazing thing about this analogy that the Apostle Paul uses, we see in verse 3, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is something to be said about receiving a robe, about being clothed by the King, or receiving this external covering from our Master. We see this in Zechariah 3:4. Zechariah says that we will all be clothed, we will receive a robe of righteousness. In Revelation 6 and 7, we hear that when the saints get to heaven, Jesus will don on them a robe of righteousness. And now we see the Apostle Paul talking about how we long to be clothed. And it's not like when we get to heaven we'll receive this coat of many colors like Joseph did. It won't be anything like that. No matter how beautiful that robe and coat of many colors could have been, it isn't even comparable to the robe of righteousness we'll get when we get to heaven and we don the robes of eternity. And I'm not talking about like a judge's robe or a choir robe or anything like that. You will exchange your corruptible body for an incorruptible one. And there's a misconception in Christianity, and it has been going on for thousands of years. We see it in medieval art. medieval paintings, medieval poetry, that when we die, we go to heaven, we get wings and we get a halo, and we'll fly around heaven kind of in this bodiless existence. But that's not what the Bible says. That's not what the Bible describes our life to be when we get to heaven. You see, the heaven part is there, but what a lot of people don't understand is that at the end of days, after the judgment seat of Christ, what does he do? He creates a new heaven and a new earth, and the new earth comes down, a new Jerusalem. It's not like we will be in some ethereal plane out flying around in the clouds and the nebulous. We'll actually walk on a physical structure. We will have physical bodies that are incorruptible, so glorious that if you saw it now, you would be tempted to worship it. We will be clothed in glory. You will exchange this jar of clay for a titanium canister. You will exchange your tent for a mansion on the hill. We will be clothed in glory. And while we're on earth, we don't see it. It's hard for us to imagine it. We can't wrap our minds around it. How can you describe the indescribable? How can you put into words the amount of beauty and glory that will come? You can't. Have you ever gone and witnessed the most beautiful, remarkable sunset you've ever seen in your life, and then you were trying to describe it to a friend, and you can't? The only thing you're left saying is, you should have been there. That's what heaven's like. You're not going to be able to describe it to your friends when you're talking to them about it over coffee. The only thing you could say is, you should be there. It's an invitation to glory. It's like telling your kids, okay, we can either go outside and play in the backyard, or we can go to Disneyland. Which one would you want to do? Unless your kid is completely smacked out of his head, he will say, let's go to the backyard and play. And I share this quote with you a lot, but C.S. Lewis said, it's like we are petulant little children sitting in the gutter making mud pies because we don't know what it is to have a holiday at the sea. And even that analogy fails on itself because heaven is much more than a holiday at the sea. Every existential longing of your heart that you have ever had will be fulfilled in an instant when you get to heaven. Perfect joy, perfect peace, perfect love, a perfect relationship. Everything that you could think of that is perfect, you will get in heaven. And that is the glory that is to come. Therefore, we are always confident and know that as long as we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. We live by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord, so we make it our goal to please Him. The confidence that you receive from being a Christian doesn't mean that your life is going to be perfect and completely devoid of suffering. The confidence that you get from being a Christian is that you get the understanding that when you endure the trial faithfully, you get something in exchange. You get to trade your battle scars for an incorruptible body. All the verbal abuse and emotional abuse and physical abuse that your body has gone through will be changed in an instant. And all the horror of this life will melt away. Do you know where Christianity is growing the most right now in our world? Where Christianity is flourishing like a freshly planted flower by a stream? It isn't England, it isn't Norway, it isn't Germany, it's not the United States. It's in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And in South America. And in the Far East, where life is lived in horror and misery. Why is that? Because the gospel of Jesus Christ comes with a breath of hope that is only hearable by somebody who is a road-weary traveler on the road of life. When we're living in our $450,000 homes in the United States and we're driving $30,000 cars and we have air conditioning wherever we go, new shoes, groceries whenever we want them, we have more than enough food that we throw a lot of it away. What does it mean to have Jesus? But when your life is racked with misery, there's a confidence that comes with knowing this life isn't all that there is. That's the confidence for a Christian. When the Apostle Paul was writing this letter to the church in Corinth, he was on the brink of death. He had been ran out of Ephesus. He had received rods and lashings. He was stoned nearly to death, shipwrecked, broken, left naked and cold and hungry, and yet he penned these words, "Therefore we are always confident and know that as long as we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we live by faith, not by sight." Paul had been beaten so much at the hands of his Roman oppressors and the Jewish people that hated him, that all he could do was live in the confident hope that this life isn't all there is. And then the Apostle Paul says, so what do we do in the middle of all this? What do we do while we're spending our time on this earth? Do we sit there and keep an account of all our suffering? Do we sit down and make a list of how bad our life is? No, he doesn't say that. What does he say? So we make it our goal to please him. What does that mean for us? When you're living your life in the middle of suffering, it's not about you. It's about your neighbor. It's about your friend that's at the end of their rope too. So we please God, and that is our goal. Jesus said people will look at you and see your good deeds and glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's how we please God. But listen, because we can get this confused. We don't earn salvation by our good deeds. What we do with our good deeds is we please Him. A lot of people think that if I'm a good enough person, if I give enough money to charity, if I help the poor, if I take care of the orphan and the widowed, I'll get to heaven. The Bible doesn't say that. It says salvation comes by faith through grace. It is a gift of God and not of works, so that no man can boast. But on the other hand, we hear in James that faith without works is dead. And what is the religion that God finds most pleasing? To take care of the widow and the orphan. You see, good deeds and works isn't something you do to earn anything. Good deeds and works comes as a natural outflowing of your love for God Himself. If you love God, you will love what He loves. If you love God, He will do what He commanded you to do. So we please Him in the meantime. And then the Apostle Paul puts a little bit of a negative point on the end. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. And the Apostle Paul is sharing this from his experience. In Acts chapter 18, when the Apostle Paul was in Corinth, he got arrested. And in Corinth, in the middle of the city, at the top of the hill, there was a common area, a courtyard, and in that courtyard there was a judgment seat. And this is where all the administrative affairs of the region of Corinth, of Achaia, happened. All the crimes were tried there, sentences were handed out, and the Apostle Paul was there in Corinth at the judgment seat. In Greek it's called the Bema. This is where the judge handed out the sentences for the things that people have done. And we too will stand before the Bema, and we will receive our judgment, whether we have done good things or whether we have done bad things. And if we have done good things, that will determine our reward. And if we have done bad things, that will determine that we're sent to hell for all eternity. So we all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And when you go alone. You can't take your mom, you can't take your dad, you can't take your wife, your husband, your brother, your sister, your cousin, your aunt. You could have one of those outspoken aunts that speak their mind. They're not going to be there defending you on Judgment Day. You're going to be standing alone in front of your Maker, giving an account of all you have done. And Jesus tells us in the Gospel of Matthew, many people will come and say, Lord, Lord, didn't I worship you? Didn't I heal people in your name? Didn't I cast out demons in your name? Didn't I do all this work in your name? And Jesus will say, depart from me, you who work iniquity. I never knew you. So we could all talk a big game. We could come to church. We could pretend. We could put on a face. Put on a show. But the way that we demonstrate to the world our relationship with Jesus Christ is how we treat other people. When people want to know whether or not you should be a Christian, you shouldn't have to say a single word. They should look at your life and see it. By your fruits you will know them. You will know who my disciples are by the love they have one for another. You see, Jesus didn't say, how will you know who my disciples are? By the way that they could quote the Bible, by how many times they pray, whether or not they could speak in tongues, whether or not they could do miracles, speak words of wisdom and knowledge, whether they could prophesy. You will know them by the love they have for one another. And when we stand before the judgment seat of Christ, we will get eternal reward or eternal punishment based on what we have done for Him while we're here. I want to read something for you this morning. I've quoted C.S. Lewis a lot already. He's one of my all-time favorite authors, but he was a man before his time and full of wisdom. And he said this, I can think of at least one such use. It may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid daily on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all our friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life to ours is as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play, but our merriment must be of that kind which exists between people who have from the outset taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption. And our charity must be as real and our charity must be a real and costly love with deep feeling for the sins in spite of which we love the sinner. No mere tolerance or indulgence which parodies love as flippancy, parodies merriment. Next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is as holy in almost the same way, for in him also Christ, the glorifier and the glorified glory himself, is truly hidden. You see, there are no ordinary people. The most influential, powerful person you could think of isn't an ordinary person. The lowliest pauper and beggar living on the street isn't an ordinary person. And it could be the fact that that most powerful person that you hold in your mind might end up a corruption and so wicked and so vile that you would encounter only in a nightmare. But that beggar, the pauper, the person that you consider worthless and dispensable could be a glory so powerful that if you saw them in the future life, you might be tempted to worship them. There are no ordinary people. That's how we must conduct our life every day. The person you meet at the grocery store is either going to be a glory or a corruption. And you're trying to help them get to the glory instead of the corruption. Our final thought this morning is there are a lot of misconceptions of what heaven will be like. We have heard from popular culture that we will be something like angels when we get there. We will have wings and halos flying about heaven like Michael and Gabriel. But this is a completely wrong understanding of heaven. We will be clothed in the perfection of a glorified body. There will be no more pain, no more disease, no more defects, no more wounds. Our new bodies will be so glorious that we would be tempted to worship them if we saw them now. This is Paul's elucidation of the wonderful promise made at the end of chapter 4. Because of this great promise, we can have the confidence in knowing that this life is not all there is. When we are away from our earthly bodies, we are in the presence of Jesus. What do we do in the meantime while we are groaning and burdened in this life? We work to please God. Not because it brings salvation, but because it testifies to our hope in Him.